I've been requested by local authorities to come and speak to you in a retrospective look back at predominantly the Battle of Shiloh and its peripheral impacts where you live here in Jackson. And with that, I want to emphasize the difference between heritage and history. We are in a library that is crammed with books, many of them history. You should read as many of them as you can. History, though, is far superseded by heritage. Heritage is history squared, because heritage happened right here. Heritage happened where you are. Heritage is who you are, because you may step out this door and all around you, the Civil War, myself, hundreds of thousands of federal troops and Confederate troops raised and fought all over this area. That's your heritage. Whether you've lived here for generations or whether you're a transplant to this area, heritage happened where you are. History is one-dimensional on a page of a book. That's good. Read it, absorb it, learn it, but you should know your heritage. And heritage happened here. Heritage is history squared. A little bit of background about Shiloh. Shiloh is the least understood, or perhaps I should say the most misunderstood battle of the Great War of the Rebellion. It is the most savage battle fought in the Western Theater, which is from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, from the border states of St. Louis, Kentucky, and so forth, to the Gulf of Mexico. It was the most savage battle fought in the Western Theater. You perhaps are thinking of Chickamauga as well. Chickamauga, it was also a savage and fearsome fight. But Shiloh, I think, was worse. Shiloh was the first major battle of the war. The war was only 51 weeks old when the first shots were fired at Shiloh. Let me digress a bit with your indulgence. For also, I ask of you your indulgence. I do not like the personal pronoun I or me. I much prefer we, us, over I or me. But since I'm speaking of the campaign and what was done and how I engineered it, I must needs use the personal pronoun, so I beg your indulgence. Fort Donelson fell on February the 16th of 1862. It was the first signal federal victory in the war. War has been going on now since April the 12th of 61. We've gone through the spring, the summer, a fall, and into the middle of a winter, and there really hasn't been any federal successes. The Confederates are doing fairly well. Their morale is high. Federal morale was not so high. Now, General George Thomas up in Mill Springs, Kentucky won a significant federal victory over the Confederates and helped keep Kentucky neutral. That victory was superseded by my victory at Fort Donelson. Fort Donelson fell, and the entire Confederate Army was surrendered. Now, some say 15,000, some say 17,000, some say as much as 20,000 Confederate troops. I could not tell you exactly how many, because, let me go back, it's early in the war. And how we handled the surrenders of armies was a learn-as-you-go process. When Buckner surrendered to me, a lot of his soldiers simply melted away into the woods. Now, Buckner surrendered, but did you know that there was another brigadier general at Fort Donelson? Bushrod Johnson Bushrod Johnson, who lived to fight another day. He simply walked off into the woods. Security was not what it would become later. That was the first army that surrendered to me. It was a major army surrender. And Sidney Johnston, General Albert Sidney Johnston, suffered much from that surrender because he did have his defense line running up through Bowling Green, Kentucky, all the way into the Appalachian Mountains. He had about a 1,000-mile long defensive line, which anybody would tell you, military, that's too long a line to defend. His headquarters being at Bowling Green, almost due north. When Fort Donelson fell, General Johnston fell back to Corinth, Mississippi. That means he gave up western Kentucky, such as the Confederates were trying to get control of Kentucky. He gave up all of West Tennessee and Middle Tennessee and established a new defensive line along the Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama border. He lost many thousands of square miles of territory, lost the first Confederate capital that surrendered in the war, Nashville, Tennessee, and it stayed in federal hands for the rest of the war. Major blow for the Confederacy. They were as depressed as we were elated with the victory at Fort Donelson. Now, there's a downside for me with Fort Donelson. It fell on February the 16th. On February the 28th, and I will not trouble you with many dates, and you don't have to remember them, you won't have a test. But on February the 28th, 12 days later, I went to Nashville, Tennessee. And I went there because I wanted to persuade General Buell, Don Carlos Buell, and I'm still trying to figure out how he got the name Don Carlos, because nobody in his family is Hispanic. And he has no Spanish background. But General Buell is on the other side of Nashville there on the Cumberland River. And I wanted to persuade him to move on Nashville and take it while all the supplies were still there. It was a major Confederate distribution point for the armies here in West Tennessee and North Mississippi and Alabama. He wouldn't do it. He would not do it. Come in, come in. One of the reasons he wouldn't do it, and this is something that makes history so fascinating when you look back, you must know the people involved. Don Carlos Buell had outranked me in the old Army before the war, before I resigned from the old Army. If he had come across the Cumberland River into Nashville, Tennessee to take the surrender, and they wanted to surrender. They didn't want us to fight a battle there and destroy the city. But my command extended to the Cumberland River in Nashville, Tennessee. Buell is on the other side of the river. If he had come across into Nashville to take the surrender, he would have been under my command. And he refused to do that. He had the mayor of Nashville and the Board of Aldermen row across the river to surrender to him outside of Nashville so he wouldn't be on the same side of the river as me, because he declined to be under my command. That tells you something of the personalities, and it tells you something of the personalities that I was having to work with, or better I should say against. But that was February the 28th. I went to see him. He did not move on Nashville. He said, "I hear the artillery," and I said, "General, that is the ammunition in warehouses that is exploding as the Confederates, Bedford Forrest, is evacuating Nashville. That's not artillery. You must move on them." He declined. I went back to my quarters at Fort Donelson in the Clarksville, Fort Donelson area. On March the 4th, my commanding officer, General Henry Halleck, Major General Henry Halleck, told me that I was relieved of command and that Major General C.F. Baldy Smith was going to take command of the Army and move it into the Pittsburgh Landing area. And on the 6th, he told me that General-in-Chief George McClellan had ordered my arrest. Now, I've just won the most singular victory of the war for the North. But my commanding officer is relieving me of command, telling me I'm under arrest, and court-martial proceedings are being developed. He said, your Army is in more disarray in victory at Fort Donelson than our Army was in defeat at Bull Run. That was not a good thing for me to hear. He said, why don't you answer me? I'd been telegraphing him daily about my presence, my position, my troop strength. But there was a rebel telegrapher between me and Halleck in St. Louis. And he was intercepting messages, changing information, not sending what he didn't want to send. So Halleck had not been hearing from me, even though I had been communicating daily. But that led to me being relieved of command and told, you're going to be court-martialed. I thought I'd just won Fort Donelson. Nashville, Tennessee is ours. The Cumberland River and the Tennessee River were ours. We had the Tennessee River all the way to Chattanooga, Stevenson, Alabama. We could penetrate with Navy boats that far. It was a signal victory. But I'm relieved of command and told that I might be arrested. I was dismayed. In the interim, President Lincoln had heard that these machinations were going on against me, and he had Secretary of War Stanton communicate with General Halleck and said, are you going to court-martial General Grant? Well, General Halleck's nickname is Old Brains, and he didn't get that nickname because he was not bright. And when he realized the President was inquiring into this matter that he had trumped up, he did not want me in that commanding position. He wanted General Smith, who was a friend of his, in command of the Army, which he put him. He wanted to eliminate me because he felt that I was an upstart, that he was my social, my intellectual, and certainly my military superior, and he would have none of me. So he put Smith in command. When President Lincoln called him, he said, oh, no, sir, Mr. Lincoln, there is no problem whatever. That's all rumor and innuendo. Nothing's being done against General Grant as he is pushing the drawer shut on court-martial papers for me. And he sends me a telegram. He restored me to command on March the 13th. So I spent a week in agony over my career and my life. I'm restored to command, and he said, in fact, I look forward to you winning many more victories for the federal forces. I found out after the war it was him that was causing all the problem. He didn't tell me that. So March 13th, I'm restored to command. March 17th, I get to Savannah, Tennessee. And this is where it starts. We had some 35,000 to 40,000 troops on the ground at Pittsburgh Landing. Do you know how it got that name? There's a Pitt family in that area, and they built a small trading post and a cabin right there on the bluff at the riverbank and the landing, and it got the name Pittsburgh Landing. That was not where we wanted to go. And keep in mind, never forget, Shiloh is the tail that wags the dog, because Shiloh was part of the Corinth Crossroads campaign. That's 16 square feet of railroad crossing in Corinth, Mississippi, the Mobile and Ohio north, the Memphis and Charleston east and west. The Army that controlled that 16 square feet of crossroads would dominate and control the area. We determined to have it. Sidney Johnston determined that we would not get it. His agenda was different from mine. That's where I was going. I had no intention of fighting a battle at Pittsburgh Landing, none whatever, none. In fact, we didn't really want to be at Pittsburgh Landing. Sherman had gone down the river to destroy Eastport, Mississippi, with railroad bridges and tracks in that area. He'd gone down there to destroy Eastport, but because of, as we have had here recently, heavy rains, he couldn't get his troops off the boats. He couldn't destroy Eastport, couldn't burn the railroad bridges, which with Comp Sherman, that greatly disappointed him. Coming back up the river though, Captain Ginn, the commander of the Tigris, my boat, became my boat, command boat, pointed out to Sherman, look here at Pittsburgh Landing. It's wide, it's flat, it's a good place to offload troops. It's 20 miles north of Corinth, Mississippi, good roads down to Corinth. So if you go to Pittsburgh Landing, you should be able to stage the Army there easily and move down to Corinth. He accepted that idea. He told General Smith, who is by now in bed in the Cherry Mansion. And if you ever have an opportunity to go to the Cherry Mansion, because as you're facing the house, that upstairs front bedroom is where General Smith was, and ultimately, after the battle, died. General Smith had been stepping from one boat to another, and as we all know, boats will move when you step on them. And as he stepped from a boat, it pushed away beneath him. He slipped and drug his shin from ankle to knee on the side of a boat with his full weight. Other than being very painful, it became deadly because he got a blood infection and went into sepsis and died, a slow and agonizing death. So he was abed when I got there. I go to Pittsburgh Landing to meet with Comp Sherman. You must understand, and being this close to Shiloh, perhaps you've been there, you must understand my perspective of when I got there. We've got tens of thousands of troops on the ground and more coming. There were ultimately 175 steamboats that brought troops from the Midwest and points north into Pittsburgh Landing. 175 steamboats loaded to the gunwales, to the rails. We're offloading. We ultimately had 65,000 troops there. We didn't have that many there the day the battle started. When I got on the ground, I immediately rode the perimeter. Now, it's a couple of miles from the river to the Shiloh meeting house, where Sherman had his headquarters. I had at that time, now I've been by now promoted to a 2-star, I'm a Major General. Immediately after the Battle of Fort Donelson, I was promoted to Major General. Even so, when I got to Pittsburgh Landing, I had my entire engineering staff and troops was one man, Lieutenant Colonel James McPherson. Also a West Point graduate, excellent engineer, and a good man, good leader. So McPherson and I rode around through the area, and I made a decision for which I have been severely criticized. But I'm going to tell you what I decided and why. I decided not to entrench or to build breastworks. Let's go back. This is early in the war. This is late March of 1862. War started April the 12th of 62, so we're 11 and a half months into the war. No real savagery in the combat, and that's where Shiloh also comes into play. So far, it had been still, even though people were surprised we're still fighting after a year, it had been, people still had the attitude, I had the attitude, it's going to be a brief war. It was still martial music, thrilling drum beats, snapping flags, pretty girls in flashy uniforms. It was still, that was still the mentality. Also, I determined not to dig in or entrench breastworks because the ground was too broken. Colonel McPherson told me it's too broken, there's too much forestry, it won't do you any good to build breastworks and entrench. And I agreed. Another reason that you should know, and this is something that I want you to take with you today. There are many people, places, events, actions, and things that seem to, with the passage of time, slide off the pages of the history book into the binding. They're no less important by who they were, what they were, where they were, or how they were. But because of the passage of time, greater things dominate and the other things just slide off the page. One of those things is, remember, it's 62, early in the war, it was considered at that time that if you dug a trench or you put up something to hide behind, that's just what you were doing. You were building something to hide behind. It was an act of cowardice. Real men don't build anything that you hide behind. A real soldier stands up toe to toe and they fire at each other. So you don't build breastworks. That's cowardly. Well, all that was going to change on April the 6th. Never to go back. But that's another reason I did not build breastworks and I did not entrench. A third reason, broken terrain, not the thing to do because that wasn't how men fought. Two reasons. This is a three-legged stool for you. The third leg on the stool is, out of that 175 steamboats loaded with soldiers, that 40,000, 45, 50, 55,000 troops piling in, 26,000 more on the way from Columbia, Tennessee with Don Carlos Buell, another 6,500 Bull Nelson coming out of Kentucky, and 5,000 with Lew Wallace up at Crump's Landing. The numbers for 1862 were staggering. But of those numbers, very few men had any military experience. Most of my soldiers, more than 3/4 of my soldiers, had never fired their weapon. Now let me repeat that. More than 3/4 of all my soldiers on the field at Pittsburgh Landing had never fired their weapon. Indeed, most of them had been issued their weapons as they were coming down the river on the steamboat. Most of them, very few of them, had any military experience. There were some Mexican War veterans who had come back in the Army when the war started. And they quickly became the leaders of training soldiers. So I made the decision that my time, my soldiers' time, was better spent with the manual of arms, loading how to handle that weapon, load and fire it, than with the pick and the spade. Better spent that way than with the pick and the spade. Now, let me bring back into the picture General Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston had a different agenda from mine. Now, he had, as I said, fallen back from up through western Ohio, down through Middle Tennessee, West Tennessee, back into Mississippi. And it was a stunning blow for the South. he was suffering severe criticism about having lost all that territory without firing a shot. It was one of the greatest acquisitions, conquering of territory that the Federal armies had in the war, and we didn't fire a shot. He determined that rather than wait for me to come to him in Corinth, he was going to come to me and give battle to me to resurrect his reputation. Military thinking, for you civilians who have no military experience or knowledge, military thinking is that in order to attack an entrenched position, a fortified position, it takes at least 3 to 4 to 1 to carry the works. So for every man behind that barricade, you need 4 men coming over the barricade if you hope to be successful. I thought that General Johnston would not leave that kind of heavily dug-in position, leave that kind of position and come and meet me on an open field. That would be military heresy. Military, some would tell you, insanity. Let them come to you. But he's thinking, I need to make a demonstration to show the Confederacy that I am the general they are, that they think I am, rather. President Davis was asked, is Albert Sidney Johnston a good general? And President Davis said, if Albert Sidney Johnston is not a general, then we have no general. That's high praise, my friends, high praise. So this is weighing on General Johnston. Another thing weighing on him, which I dare say might be the more important, he knew that if he waited for me to come to him, that I was going to have upwards of 100,000 soldiers. By the time we got everybody in place, we'd have close to 100,000. He did not want to wait as good a defensive position as he had for me to gather that kind of an army, which would be a juggernaut, and come at him. So he determined he was going to attack me. Well, there are those who would tell you that I was surprised at Shiloh. I will tell you I was not. I knew that Sidney Johnston was out there. I knew that there was a considerable force around our lines there at Snake Creek, Owl Creek, Lick Creek, along the river. We'd been hearing them rumble and fire and shoot for a few days. There'd been cavalry. We'd seen some infantry gatherings, so we knew that they were out there. I thought it was a reconnaissance in force. I didn't think that his whole army was coming at me. Given what I knew, I was assuming that Johnston might attack me on the 9th, maybe the 8th, but not the 6th. This is where, as the time frame is moving in, I have my crutch. On Friday night, the 4th of April, I had gone upriver, as it is, from Cherry Mansion to Pittsburgh Landing to work with Comp Sherman and to see what our status was. I'd gone down there and it was a dark, dark night. It's that old joke, it was a dark and stormy night. Well, it was. The only light that we had was when the lightning flashes crackled and ripped across the sky and lit things for a moment. Going from the meeting house, Shiloh meeting house, back to the river, I could not see anything. None of us in my party could. And I had to rely on my horse for his footing. Now, if you go to Pittsburgh Landing, where the ramp is, where we were offloading, you will note as you stand there at the Tennessee River and look back up to your left where I believe a cemetery is now, you will see what a precipitate drop there is. And if you look up to your right, you will see another really high embankment and what a precipitate drop it is. I was coming back to the river and my horse got to the edge of the embankment and he went over the embankment in the darkness. He fell heavily. Of course, he was weighing about 1,200 pounds. And he fell on his left side, which caught my left leg from my hip to my ankle under the full weight of the horse. If it had not been so muddy and soft from a week of rain, it would have crushed my leg, and I would probably have died from that. As it turned out, they got me on the boat, got me back to the Cherry Mansion about an hour later, and my leg was so swollen they had to cut my boot off my left leg. I was in absolute agony. My physician thought my leg was broken, but he couldn't tell because of the swelling so big and so quickly. He quickly, though, the next day determined it was not broken. But that's why I have my crutch, because I was wearing a slipper, a house slipper on my left foot. On Saturday, very painful, spent the day there at the Cherry Mansion, and Sunday morning the 6th, got up, hobbled down those steps from the second floor and was sitting in the dining room, about to take a sip of coffee, and I heard that boom, that long straining echo, and then another, and another. And I knew what it was. And I didn't even take a sip of the coffee. I set it down, clinks on the saucer, turned to my staff and said, "Gentlemen, the ball is in motion." Hobbled down the steps, got to the Pittsburgh Landing about 8 o'clock. Now, I've got to be helped on my horse because I can't use my left leg. So they would push me up on the horse and I stuck it between my leg and the saddle. So I fought the Battle of Shiloh, the 6th and the 7th, with my crutch stuck between my leg and my saddle, wearing a house shoe on my left foot, and in total agony. I was never out of severe pain. When I got there, the first thing that I did was order more ammunition sent forward to the front line where the combat was raging. The Confederates had hit us there, the bulk of them at Fraley Field. And they had a 3-mile-long front with 3 lines about a quarter mile between them coming at us. But I want you to, just as I stressed, Shiloh is the tail that wags the dog. You never hear about the Corinth campaign or the Crossroads campaign. You always hear about Shiloh. If it hadn't been for the Crossroads, there would not have been a Shiloh. Another thing that I want you to remember about the Battle of Shiloh. Let's see, this wall here will represent the Tennessee River. All the federal forces, you are the federal forces. The Confederates are coming this way. People seem to think, remember I started out saying that Shiloh is the least understood or perhaps the most persistently misunderstood battle in the war. Sidney Johnston's plan was never to push all of us back with our backs to the river. It seems most people think that's what he was trying to do. He was not trying to do that. In fact, that was his worst fear that it would happen. What Sidney Johnston wanted to do was to hit me from the south and get in between us and the river and push me into that swampland north of Shiloh. And as you drive down that highway, I urge you to go to the battlefield. As you're going from Adamsville, Savannah into Shiloh, look to your left, and you'll see to this very day that land is way below the road. And if you look, as the closer you get to the battlefield, the more you see it gets to be wetland. And it was up to the thigh and deeper in places. Johnston wanted to sweep in, cut me from the river, and push all of us this way, to your left, into the swamplands and defeat us in detail. That was his plan. Well, I want to call your attention to the Third Army that was at Shiloh. Did you know that there was a Third Army there? There were Federals, and there were Confederates, and there was the geography. Shiloh was the first battle in that war where geography played a major role. The weather was a significant contributor because it's been raining. But with that geography, I just a moment ago said, when you stand at the landing, look up to your right. Go up there if you are of a mind. On the other side are Indian mounds close by. But as you get on the other side of that steep embankment, I guess it's 40 feet deep or high, look down as you're looking at the river, and you'll see a gully there that is, two men could stand one on top of the other and not be out of how deep the water was. So the rain was filling all of these gullies and creeks. Johnston did not know the ground as well as he thought he did. And when he moved those armies, those beautiful long lines of troops, some 45,000 troops moving at one time, you cannot imagine what that looks or sounds like. But as he was sweeping those long battle lines into Fraley's Field, from Fraley's Field out to the river, and from Fraley's Field up north where the park entrance is now, his soldiers were caught up in those gullies and ditches and creeks, the ups and downs of the terrain. They lost their lines. Troops, units got mixed up. Sometimes officers on both sides were commanding troops from multiple units that they did not know, who did not know them. And it became a melee. Also remember that I have stressed how many men had no military experience. So remember this, Shiloh was essentially a riot that happened for 2 days between two groups of civilians. There was very little military about the Battle of Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing. They were two civilian mobs trying to kill each other. But Johnston's plan early went awry. He couldn't cut between me and the river and push us all into the wetlands. What happened was he was stalled as you're at the river at Pittsburgh Landing, that steep embankment I keep referring to. He was stalled in that area and had to wheel around to our right as you're facing the Army, the Confederates. And we were able to put up a stiff resistance. Now, you hear stories about how the federal troops were just routed. Well, I would quote General Buell to make a point. General Buell, when he got there that morning, they said he'd arrived at Savannah, Tennessee the night before and was under orders to report to me, but he did not. Now, can you imagine the effrontery of a man who's under my command who's got orders to report to Grant, it's not as if he did not know where I was. He knew where my headquarters were there at the Cherry Mansion. He got to Savannah that night, the night of the 5th, or the 6th rather, and did not report to me. By the time he tried to get to me, I'm already on the way to the battle. But he was appalled at the thousands of men who had fallen back, had been routed and came back to Pittsburgh Landing and were cowering. They were scared to death. They hadn't seen combat before, seen the elephant, as we refer to it, seeing the elephant, seeing combat. These men they're boys. They had not seen the elephant. So many of them routed, went back to the river. Most stood their ground and fought admirably all day on the 6th. But Buell was hitting them with the flat of his sword and cursing and swearing at them, telling them to get on back up to the battle. I'll shoot you where you lie. And I told him, you could, if you wanted to, General, you could shoot those men and they wouldn't make a move. They're not going back in there. They'll be all right. They'll go back. They're just scared. And the rear of a battle is not the place to determine how well the battle is going. You need to be at the front. There you will be able to tell how your forces are faring. And we were holding our own. By about 5 o'clock the end of Saturday, we had fallen back to our last line of defense. Colonel Webster had ordered that all the artillery that we could line up be amassed there. And I believe to this very day that there are some guns that are still on that line. And you may go there should you choose to go to Shiloh. And you can see where my last line of defense was that day. That night, rain began again. A frog drowner, maybe 2 frog drowners. I tried to go in the cabin there for the Pittsburgh Landing, but that was a hospital, and they were cutting off the arms and the legs, and I couldn't stand that. I thought it would be better to subject myself to the elements than to watch this suffering. I went back out into the rain, sat under a tree. Now picture this, if you will, because it's one of the pivotal moments of the war. I'm sitting under a tree, trying to smoke my cigar, which was hard because it was soaking wet. And I stood up and I'm thinking about what to do. And out of the darkness, in the pouring rain and darkness, steps Comp Sherman. He just appeared almost like a wraith. And he said, "Well, Grant," he always called me Grant. He never called me anything but Grant, in that manner. And he said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day today, haven't we?" And I said, "Yes, we have." And I took my cigar out of my mouth and jabbed with it, and I said, "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." There was a silence. And Sherman cleared his throat and said, "Well, I better get back to my command." And I said, "Best you do, General. We will hit them at the first light in the morning." Years later, when General Sherman wrote his memoirs, he said that he had actually come to tell me to retreat and fall back across the Tennessee River. And when you go there, you will see it is not very wide. But he had come to tell me we need to fall back across the river, retreat. But he said the look in Grant's eyes and his tone of voice told him, suggested to him, that it would be better not to suggest retreat. And apparently I was the only federal officer on that field that wasn't anticipating going back across the river. We did attack the next morning at daylight. I had been informed that General Johnston was probably dead. PGT Beauregard had taken command. We fought again until about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then Beauregard ordered falling back of Confederate forces. It was not a rout. He fell back in an orderly manner. We disengaged. I was criticized for not pursuing him, but I felt that we had had quite enough of their hospitality. And if they would, as General Sherman said, if he'll leave us alone, we'll leave him alone. And they fell back. And it was over. Or was it? I want to tell you, and I'll finish my remarks and perhaps some questions. Shiloh is significant for several reasons. First major battle, it was the first major battle of the war. I do not denigrate what happened at First Bull Run. Men died there, men suffered there, men were permanently injured there. Nothing they did is to be diminished. But Shiloh overshadowed everything that had been done in the war to that point. The casualty lists, I believe, for Shiloh were 23,741, depending on who you talk to. But it's 23,700 and something men. There were 3,500 men dead on the field. And that is more men dead, killed in combat, more American soldiers than had been killed in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined in 36 hours. Let me say that again. That's more American soldiers dead on the field in one battle than had been killed in all three of the previous wars that America had fought in one day, 36 hours. As I looked at Duncan Field, there in front of Ruggles Battery and the Hornet's Nest, as I looked at the peach orchard, I saw it was carpeted with bodies. And that's when I wrote my wife Julia a letter, and I said a couple of things that I would like you to remember. It was possible to walk from one side of a field to the other, stepping only on the bodies of dead men, your feet never touching the ground. It was then that the war was no longer pretty girls and uniforms, loud and enthralling music. Everybody in America knew this was not a 90-day lark, because it was a war fought for cause and country, patriotism and principle on both sides. Regardless of how you feel about the issues, you cannot dispute a man's dedication to duty, his dedication to cause and country, patriotism and principle, whichever side he fought on. That also means that the armies were peopled by men from every walk of life. Every level of the social strata was represented, from the poorest man to the wealthiest man, on both sides. That means that the dead, those 23,741 or so men killed and wounded, the 3,500 dead on the field, they represented more than 40% of every household in America, because it completely transcended all levels of life. 40% of the homes in America had somebody killed or wounded at Shiloh. One battle. And when the smoke cleared, everybody knew this is not going to be a 90-day lark, and I've got to get in it before it's over with. I told Julia I used to be in the camp that thought there'll be one more great struggle and the war will be over. I no longer feel that way. I think this is going to be a long and bloody fight that's going to be fought until one side or the other, holding principles so dear as unto death, is going to have to yield those principles to the other side. And I submit to you that is precisely what happened. I knew, though, that the federal forces would prevail, and I will tell you why. As ghastly as Shiloh was, the expression for the rest of the war, the commonplace expression was, "Ooh, I hadn't been that scared since Shiloh." Shiloh was a marker in American history. It was the stake in the ground for the American War of the Rebellion. But I knew that we would prevail because the South hit us with the best that they had. If you look at the Southern Confederate Command, it's a list of who's who in American military history. Albert Sidney Johnston, P.G.T. Beauregard, Breckinridge, who'd been a vice presidential candidate. You've got Nathan Bedford Forrest, Hardee, on and on. Look at Pope. Go ahead and look at who all fought in that battle on the Confederate side. So it was the best they had. Also, they hit us with the most that they had. Johnston put together between 40 and 45,000 Confederate troops. He got as many troops as he could possibly get in the Western Theater. He hit us with everything he had. I believe there were some 75 or 76 regiments in the Confederate Army. They hit us like a juggernaut with everything they could put on the field, the most men they could pull together. And they hit us as hard as they could. After that battle, I had a very healthy respect for the Confederate soldier. A very healthy respect indeed. He was the consummate fighting man. And when we grappled there all over those fields and forests there at Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing, we all had a healthy respect for each other once the armies disengaged. But I came away from Shiloh knowing the Confederate soldier is a man to be reckoned with, just as he knew that the Federal soldier was not a ribbon clerk or a mechanic, that he could and would indeed fight. So given those three circumstances, I felt that we would ultimately prevail. But Shiloh was the stake in the ground, I submit to you, for the War of the Rebellion.